Greetings, friends of liberty. Hoover Institution fellow and present Stanford and former Princeton lecturer Stephen Kotkin is best known for his 3-volume biography of Joseph Stalin, which has garnered rave reviews for its enormous depth and breadth. But Kotkin's reputation also extends to many other works on post-Stalin Russia and the Soviet Union's collapse, such as Uncivil Society, 1989, and the implosion of the communist establishment, and Armageddon Averted, the Soviet collapse, 1970 to 2000. It is thus not surprising that, since Russia invaded Ukraine in February of 2022, Professor Kotkin often has been asked how to deal with his fascist, ethno-nationalist, imperialist state headed by mass murderer Vladimir Putin. In brief, he has answered by consistently arguing that Ukraine should pursue a negotiated settlement and enduring armistice with Russia. Let's examine his position more closely by seeing in Part 1 how he has understood the relevant military and political realities of the last 4 years, in Part 2 why he thinks a negotiated settlement would be the most likely to achieve the best outcome for Ukraine, and in Part 3, let's examine the viability of his solutions. Part 1, Kotkin's understanding of the present realities. Kotkin believes, number one, or has until 2025, that it's unrealistic to expect Ukraine to win back all of its territory. So unrealistic that he said that Crimea is going back to Ukraine the day after Texas goes back to Mexico. Number two, he believes that Putin doesn't need Ukraine. He's already got Russia. But Ukraine needs Ukraine. They don't have another state. And Putin is saying, if I can't have Ukraine, well, then nobody can have Ukraine, especially the Ukrainians. In other words, your country, your people continue to die. Your infrastructure continues to get ruined. Your schools, your hospitals, your cultural artifacts get bombed or stolen. Your children get taken away as orphans. That's where we are right now. Number three, he believes that Russia has, compared to Ukraine, virtually unlimited resources and can throw manpower and materiel at the Ukrainian lines for many years to come. He says the Russian leadership doesn't really care about its people. It has no problem throwing tens of thousands of men into the meat grinder. And if most of them die, they just do it again. They are a giant neighbor armed with nuclear weapons, willing and able to build a war machine well beyond its GDP and ostensible means, and indifferent to the loss of its own lives. But Ukrainian soldiers live in a democracy. Their leadership cares. They can't just sacrifice their people in big numbers. Furthermore, regarding military aid from the West, he said in 2023, we're not going to be able to succeed the next 20 years at $200 million a day from the U.S. alone, as well as our European partners. If the Russian army disintegrates in the field, we're good. But if they don't, then what? What's the plan? He adds that, given Russia's defense production, Ukraine can destroy vast quantities of Russian weaponry, which they've been doing, and still make little to no progress. Number four, he believes that Russia has suffered 4 strategic setbacks thus far. Number one, Ukraine remained a sovereign state and halted or slowed most Russian advances. Number two, the West and NATO were revived, at least until Trump's recent hostile actions and rhetoric, and new life and cohesion breathed into both militarily. Number three, Russia was humiliated by its comparative failures on land, sea, and air. And number four, with China and Xi siding with Russia, China to a degree is losing favor in Europe. Number five, he believes it highly unlikely Putin will be ousted from his premiership, saying that Putin is very competent in dealing with his political rivals, whether by making them jump out of the 20th story of high-rises or by feeding them Anthony's poison arrow frog dart poison. Number six, he believes that sanctions so far really haven't worked. And finally, number seven, he believes that Ukraine's goals are maximalist and too ambitious in A, wanting to roll back all Russian advances, B, conduct war crime tribunals, and C, get reparations. So given that this is Kotkin's view of the present situation, what does he suggest should be done? What are the various elements of his solution? Part 2, Kotkin's solutions. He believes, number 1, as previously mentioned, that a ceasefire between the two countries that would resemble the armistice between subsequent division of North and South Korea, with a demilitarized zone between them, but no official recognition that the areas conquered by Russia are theirs legally. As Kotkin says, the problem is we have to live in the circumstances we've got. If you look at the North Korea-South Korea outcome, it's a terrible outcome. At the same time, it enables South Korea to flourish under American security guarantees and protection. Why should this be the preferred goal? We need the fighting to stop. We need the 18 to 30-year-old Ukrainians who are left not to die. We need the 35 and above Ukrainians not to die. We need the Ukrainian kids going to school in Poland and Germany and elsewhere to come home and go to school in the Ukrainian language and be the future of the country. We need them to invest and rebuild a new economy. Number 2, he believes that Ukraine should be invited to join the EU and should get security guarantees, saying, if Ukraine regains as much of its territory as it physically can get on the battlefield, not all of it, potentially, but does get EU accession, that would be a definition of victory? Of course it would be. In addition, this would mean a strong defense establishment with weapons productions at home and continued financing for that from its European partners. Number 3, he advises against reoccupying the Crimean Peninsula, saying that if that happened, Russia has 2 million ethnic Russians inside the Ukrainian state and can mount a permanent insurgency and sabotage campaign with its gigantic population to recruit from. If they do, what are you going to do? You're going to ethnically cleanse them? You're going to force them out of Crimea in the hundreds of thousands or more? Furthermore, this would incentivize Russia to attack again tomorrow or 20 or 30 years from now. Regaining Crimea is terrible for Ukraine winning the peace in the long term. Number 4, he believes that Europe and the US should have left open the possibility of encouraging regime change in Russia. As Kotkin says, through fear of escalation, we said, we're not going to do covert operations or political stuff to threaten your regime in Moscow. That's so much bigger than the F-16s or the tanks or the long-range missiles because that's the variable. That's the key to forcing an armistice, to winning the peace, rather than just winning on the battlefield. When he's scared that his regime could go down, he'll cut and run. How could regime change be facilitated? He says that comes in the form of alternatives to his rule. Numerous Russians feel that Russia is on a self-defeating trajectory right now. They have no sympathy for Ukraine, but they have a lot of sympathy for Russia, and they feel that an end to the war would help Russia regain the civilian economy that it's lost. The US and Europe are recruiting them inside. We know who they are. Let's get those men in uniform. Let's pressure this regime. Let's push and push and push until Putin says, okay, you guys, take the pressure off of me. He adds, military and economic pressure without political pressure has not worked. He advocates numerous other supplementary measures as well, such as releasing the $300 billion in Russian bank reserves still held by Brussels. Number 5. He believes that because of Ukraine's maximalist, unrealistic demands and the comparative strength of the Russians, that Kyiv should be forced to negotiate. He says, from the Ukrainian point of view, they have a maximalist understanding of what the peace is. It's about justice. It's about reparations. It's about war crimes tribunals. It's understandable. It's completely justified from a moral point of view. But I applaud President Trump's forced imposition of a negotiation process. Although Trump lacks follow-through and patience, he lacks consistency. However, Trump's instincts are correct. Ukraine, more than Russia, needs this war to end. Trump is correct. Ending the war is Ukraine's best hope. This is the only country they have, and it's being devastated. Kotkin admits, however, that Trump put all the pressure on the Ukrainians and, so far, next to no pressure on Putin and the Russian establishment to force the negotiations. Finally, number 6, he believes that the Biden strategy failed. Why? Because the argument was that we're supporting Ukraine to put them in the best position to negotiate a more favorable settlement. But the problem was there were never any negotiations. Let's turn now to part 3 in evaluating Professor Kotkin's solutions. Number 1. As Leo Tolstoy famously wrote in War and Peace, it takes two to tango, in both war and peace. So if one side starts a war but the other doesn't fight, you have surrender. And if one side wants to stop but the other refuses to stop, you'll still have a war. It takes two to tango, or in Russian, tango tancuit odvyodvyom. Kotkin's idea that a negotiated solution is possible or realistic fails under the present circumstances and has failed for 4 years because there's no reason to think that Putin will ever stop fighting unless he's on the brink of utter defeat and military catastrophe. In other words, until there's a realistic possibility that Ukraine will start taking back territory consistently, Putin won't negotiate. And if he'll only negotiate under those circumstances, when he's facing military catastrophe and the disintegration of his army, who would much care that he would negotiate then? Because then Ukraine would be able, by force of arms, to be able finally to reclaim what he stole from them anyway. They wouldn't need him. Now, Kotkin realizes this, and understanding Putin's stubbornness has suggested the answer is to threaten Putin with political alternatives. He laments that neither Biden nor Trump has encouraged or developed these. But this seems a dubious and speculative solution, and while organizing and empowering the efforts of the Russian opposition outside of Russia could not hurt, the problem is that neither Biden nor Trump has done this, likely because there's little chance for its success. I would ask Professor Kotkin, the historian, is there a single example in world history of this tactic having ever succeeded? I can't find any, at least not in the modern era. The grim reality is that Putin, until fairly recently, exercised an iron grip on the country. But only now, as Ukraine succeeds militarily, do we see his hold starting to weaken, as he deprives Russians of more and more of the necessities of modern life and destroys their economy and future. And that brings us to the only other method of forcing Putin to the negotiating table, and that's arming Ukraine to the hilt, as much as Europe, America, and the world can. Now, while Kotkin has argued for arming Ukraine to a degree, he hasn't agreed to arming it so that it can beat Russia and take back most of its territory. But ironically, that is precisely what would put the most pressure on Putin, while at the same time giving Ukraine a realistic possibility of being militarily capable of taking back all of its land. What Kotkin has misjudged, like so many experts, is the ability of Ukraine to win the war, or at least have significant battlefield successes, if it receives full support. And this precisely is what we're seeing on the battlefield in 2026. Ukraine has stopped Russia from advancing, and in the last months is starting to take back its own territory. This because the products of its innovative drone technology and its homegrown missile and defense industry are becoming so capable that it is starting to destroy Russia not just on the front lines, but also its refineries, terminals, factories, and ports throughout Russia. Russia is losing so many men and so much equipment that it has no hope of replacing those in the long run or in maintaining its present frontline position. But all that increasing success could have been achieved quicker if A, Ukraine had been properly supplied by the West, B, given the freedom to strike Russian targets throughout the country from the beginning, and C, if sanctions had been more consistently applied to Russia and its allies like China and India. So when Kotkin talks about needing to supply Ukraine with $200 million a day for 20 years, that was silly. Virtually no war lasts that long. And if Ukraine's allies had supplied it with more weapons earlier and given Ukraine more freedom to use them, it might have already won back much of its territory, as it appears to be doing now. Number 2. So, leaving Vlad the Bad and the silly possibility of forcing him to the negotiating table without maximally supporting Ukraine militarily, that brings us to yet another bad actor, President Donald J. Trump. And in fact, a whole slew of bad actors, since Trump has filled his administration front to back with Russia-loving apparatchiks or incompetents who, like himself, admire Putin's fascism and nationalism and who would love nothing more than to see Ukraine dismembered. These anti-heroes include Tulsi Gabbard, the dearly departed director of national intelligence, who, for example, doubted the clear evidence that Russian ally Bashar Assad had used chemical weapons hundreds of times. J.D. Vance, that promoter of the corrupt Hungarian kleptocrat and authoritarian Viktor Orban, himself a puppet of Putin, with Vance saying that halting U.S. funding and weapons shipments to Ukraine is one of the things I'm proudest we've done in this administration. Diplomatic clown, real estate mogul Stephen Witkoff, one of Trump's many cronies, who at one point simply brought Putin's wish list for Ukrainian surrender back to Trump in Washington as a serious proposal. And many other enemies of Ukraine, such as Elon Musk, who calls Senator Mark Kelly a traitor for supporting Ukraine, Vivek Ramaswamy, who wants to deny Ukraine membership in NATO, Elbridge Colby, who unilaterally canceled congressionally mandated aid to Ukraine before President Trump reinstated it, Pete Hegseth, delaying weapons shipments and aid, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, who recently refused to reinstate the sanctions on Russian oil, and last but not least, Trumples himself, who refused to sell Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine, refused to allow the Ukrainians themselves to negotiate with the Russians, and never allowed the U.S. to work with Ukraine to utilize their extraordinary drone technology, which might have significantly helped the U.S. in its present war with Iran. And so, contrary to what Kotkin has said, that Trump's instincts are correct, the reality is Trump and his band of lawless apparatchiks could never be trusted to help Ukraine win the peace. This borders on fantasy. On the other hand, Biden's administration was filled with people terrified of angering Putin, like Biden himself and Jake Sullivan, and so the actual pressure they might have exerted on Putin with deep strikes and the destruction of his war machine and infrastructure never materialized. Number 3, Professor Kotkin has claimed that Putin's hold on power is strong, but presently it appears weaker with more and more Russians becoming unhappy with the war. Number 4, Professor Kotkin has claimed that Putin is actually afraid of Trump, and Trump is the only one who could hurt Putin in a big way. But that statement is misleading. Putin understands that Trump admires him and his corruption, and in his lust for money and power is indeed directly emulating him as far as he can. There are dozens of examples of Trump in his fanboy cravenness caving into Putin, the most recent being when Trump asked Zelensky not to attack Putin's May Day victory parade with drones. Imagine Trump asking Putin, a modern-day version of Hitler, for a favor from the man whose country is being destroyed. That cravenness is Trump's true nature, which Putin, as a former KGB agent dealing with informants, understands very well. Number 5. Kotkin, as quoted earlier, argued that Russia doesn't care about how many of its soldiers die. But that indifference is turning into a liability because it's A, allowing Ukrainians to kill so many Russians that the Russians aren't even able to replace their losses anymore, and B, their loved ones are increasingly unhappy for this reason. In other words, more and more Russians are starting to care and to hate Putin. That's a problem for him. The same truth applies to Kotkin's statement that Ukraine can destroy vast quantities of Russian weaponry, which they've been doing, and still make little to no progress. No, they're definitely making progress now. Number 6. Despite, as Kotkin said, sanctions not being consistently imposed and thus not working very well to weaken Russia's economy, the Ukrainians are starting to impose kinetic sanctions on Russia. They are now hitting home more and more, and if the price of oil ever goes back to normal, Russian revenue, and with it its ability to fund the war, would be fatally compromised. Number 7. Kotkin's objections that if Ukraine retakes Crimea, what do you do with the Russians has little substance, since Ukraine dealt peaceably with this Russian population before without any problems. If there weren't problems before, how likely would there be if Russia were defeated? In conclusion, the best way to get a favorable outcome for both Ukraine and the West is to maximize military and financial aid to Ukraine. If that had happened, the success that the Ukrainians now consistently are having would have come even earlier, as will the end of the war with a just outcome for both parties, Ukraine reclaiming most or all of its territory with Russia defeated. I bid you well, and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.